In recent years, the nature of storytelling has shifted dramatically. Digital media platforms have transformed not only how stories are shared, but how they are created and experienced. Where traditional filmmaking prioritises structure and uniformity, the rise of online spaces are now blurring these boundaries. Stories are now more fragmented, personal and reflexive, often created by individuals. At the same time, these stories emerge from a culture saturated with irony, constantly self-aware, and an increasing need to perform authenticity. This evolution has been accelerated by the pandemic years, where physical isolation made digital expression not just dominant, but essential. Creators, confined by the same global conditions as their audiences, turn to the internet not only to entertain, but to process and reflect. For many, the screen became both a stage and a mirror, a space where identity, labour and emotion converged. It's within this context that Bo Burnham's Inside was conceived. Inside is not a traditional comedy special, filmed entirely by Burnham over the course of a year during lockdown. It presents a series of songs, sketches and behind-the-scenes fragments that reflect a deepening state of creative and emotional strain. The special takes place entirely in one room, which gradually transforms from a neutral production space into a psychological landscape, messier, more claustrophobic, and increasingly reflective of Burnham's deteriorating mental health. The absence of a live audience heightens the tension. Burnham performs for the camera and for himself, within a feedback loop of creation, critique, and collapse. The early sections of the special lean more into humour and satire, poking at influencer culture and online absurdity. But as Inside progresses, it becomes darker and more introspective. In Welcome to the Internet, Burnham captures the chaotic energy of life online, blending childlike wonder with a sinister undertone. In That Funny Feeling, he offers a quiet, lyrical reflection on a world seemingly teetering on the edge of collapse. And in All Eyes on Me, Burnham performs in a surreal, stylised space where the line between sincerity and performance disappears entirely. These shifts in tone mirror the fluctuations of digital life, one that is contradictory and emotionally taxing. Emerging in the mid-2000s as one of YouTube's earliest viral stars, Burnham's early work reflected the DIY ethos and satirical edge of online comedy. As he transitioned into more traditional formats, like his Comedy Central stand-up specials, then going on to direct his debut film 8th Grade with production house A24. Burnham continued to explore themes of self-awareness, anxiety, and the performance of identity. Inside represents both a return to his roots as a solo creator and an evolution of his ongoing concerns, now intensified by solitude and global crisis. This dissertation will explore Inside as a work shaped by and reflective of digital-era storytelling. Its form, themes and production methods offer insight into the changing role of the filmmaker in a world where screens mediate not just how we tell stories, but how we understand ourselves. Through analysis of Inside's aesthetics, authorship and emotional language, as well as reference to critical frameworks surrounding digital performance and internet culture, this project will examine how one room, one camera, one artist captured something deeply resonant about life in the digital age. In Inside, Bo Burnham presents more than just a performance. He constructs a layered, often unsettling study of performance itself. At its heart, Inside is not only about being watched, but about watching oneself being watched, again and again, in an infinite feedback loop of self-conscious creation. These recursive dynamics draw heavily from theories of performativity and authorship, particularly those informed by Judith Butler's notion of the self as a performance, and Roland Barthes' famous proclamation of the death of the author. In Burnham's hands, authorship is not authority, it is exposure. One of the most striking features of Inside is its willingness to interrogate the conditions of its own creation. It is not merely a recorded performance, but a meta-performance, a performance about performing. Burnham is alone in a single room, but this space becomes a theatre, a studio, a prison, and a confessional. Within it, he constructs elaborate musical numbers, comedy sketches, and direct addresses, all of which exist in tension with one another. These shifting modes suggest a fractured authorship, one that cannot be pinned to a stable identity. What we see in Inside is not the author as a sovereign voice, but the author as a split subject, constantly reflecting on the act of making and the instability of meaning within it. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the recurring motif of self-surveillance. Burnham records himself recording himself, edits footage of him editing footage, and reacts in real time to his own creations. These are not mere stylistic flourishes, they evoke the structure of contemporary media consumption, where creators are expected to monitor and respond to audience reaction in an unending loop. This self-awareness, which might once have been seen as a critical distance, now becomes an obligation to always be watching the self from the outside. The camera in Inside does not offer a window to the world. It turns inward, revealing the gaze Burnham casts upon himself. As Michael Foucault's work on surveillance suggests, power in the digital age is not only exercised by institutions, but internalized by individuals who come to monitor themselves. Burnham enacts this condition with uncanny precision. At the same time, Inside is acutely aware of the performative contradictions it embodies. Burnham acknowledges his privilege, his neuroses, and his complicity in the systems he critiques. In Problematic, he stages a musical apology for his younger self's offensiveness, parodying the public spectacle of accountability while also appearing genuinely remorseful. It is a self-conscious performance of self-awareness, both sincere and ironic, staged yet emotionally resonant. Burnham never allows the viewer to settle comfortably in a single interpretation of this. He disarms critique by anticipating it, embodying it, and then folding it back into the narrative. This tension is central to contemporary understandings of authorship in the age of social media. As Sarah Bannett-Weiser argues, in a culture of branding and personal exposure, authenticity itself becomes a form of performance. To be authentic is to adopt the correct effective cues, to display the right kind of vulnerability at the right moment. Burnham plays with this logic by turning his breakdowns into set pieces and staging emotional collapse as part of the show. In one sequence, he sits silently in front of the camera, head in hands, breathing heavily. The light is stark and the composition is precise. It feels raw, but also controlled. Is this a real breakdown or a dramatized version of one? The question itself becomes moot. The emotional impact arises precisely from the collapse of the boundary between the two. In this way, Inside echoes what performance theorist Richard Schneider describes as restored behavior. That is, performance as behavior that is repeated, rehearsed, and always already mediated. Even the most intimate or spontaneous moments in Inside are implicated in this logic. Burnham's tears, his laughter, even his silence, they are performances, not because they are fake, but because they are offered for an audience, framed by a lens and repeated until they fit within the structure of the work. This is not to say that Bo Burnham is insincere. Rather, it suggests that sincerity itself is no longer outside of performance. It is embedded within it. Another crucial aspect of Burnham's performative authorship lies in his use of voice. Across the special, he alternates between singing, speaking, whispering, and shouting, often switching mid-sentence or mid-song. This modulation of voice becomes a strategy for both control and release. In All Eyes on Me, he adopts the voice of a hypnotist or cult leader, commanding the viewer's attention while confessing to have had panic attacks the previous year. The tone is seductive, but the content is anxious. This dissonance highlights the tension between the performed voice and the internal self, a tension familiar to anyone who has ever felt the need to create their own identity. Burnham is not simply expressing himself through performance, he is showing what it feels like to be trapped in performance, to find no way of being that is not somehow already a role. This entrapment is mirrored visually through framing and mise-en-scène. Burnham frequently positions himself in the centre of frame, surrounded by darkness or dwarfed by harsh lighting. The room itself becomes a metaphor for the mental state he occupies. In some scenes, he manipulates the light to create spotlights or harsh shadows, recalling theatrical or religious iconography, again drawing attention to the idea of performance as a spectacle. But even these choices are carefully orchestrated. The moments of supposed chaos are deliberate, the disorder is staged. As Roland Barthes might suggest, Bo Burnham's authorship resides in the layering of meaning, where the text of Inside is not limited to its content, but the codes it deploys and disrupts. In Inside, authorship is both hyper-visible and fundamentally unstable. Burnham is director, editor, cinematographer, and performer, yet he constantly questions his right to those roles. He jokes about turning 30, about being a white man with a platform, about having nothing to say yet continuing to speak. These self-effacing moments do not absolve him of critique, but they complicate the notion of a singular, stable, authorial voice. What emerges instead is an author who is deeply implicated in the systems he examines, who cannot step outside of them and so must create from within them, reflexively and ambivalently. Ultimately, Inside offers a portrait of authorship that is performative, unstable, and deeply mediated. Burnham's work does not claim authority, but rather invites the viewer to participate in its contradictions. He reveals the labour behind the performance, stages the collapse of the performance, and then reassembles it before our eyes. It is a kind of authorship that suits our current moment, one defined not by mastery but by transparency, not by the singular voice, but by a chorus of selves in dialogue and in conflict with one another. To speak about alienation in the 21st century is, at this point, to almost risk redundancy. The language of isolation, disconnection, and numbness has become so ingrained in online discourse that it barely registers as shocking. Inside doesn't just talk about alienation, it performs it, it inhabits it, and constructs its very structure around it. What Burnham achieves is something distinct from simply representing solitude on screen. He builds a self-contained digital environment that mirrors the exact emotional experience of living life on the internet, where every expression is filtered, every connection is mediated, and where our most intimate feelings pass through layers of performance before they ever reach another person. There is something uniquely modern about watching a man film himself losing his mind in a room. But more specifically, watching him film himself, watching himself lose his mind. Burnham's relationship to the camera is no longer that of performer to audience. The screen has become an emotional translator. When he breaks down, he doesn't cry to himself, he cries to a lens. The lens is the witness, the confessor, and the mirror. It's the only thing that listens and the only thing that truly sees him. This act of turning inward, of living through the screen, is a condition deeply tied to the concept of screen life. As Lev Manovich notes in The Language of New Media, digital interfaces are no longer tools we use, they are environments which we inhabit. And in Inside, the room becomes that interface, a physical and psychological space lit by LED screens, washed in the blue glow of softboxes, cluttered with keyboards, cables, and wires. Burnham's world is one of extension cords and reflections, where the boundary of the body and the machine blur. There is no off-stage in Inside, because the stage is the screen, and it is always on. But while this screen life provides connection, it also flattens it. Emotional expression becomes performance by the necessity. There's a reason so many of Burnham's songs are about pretending to be okay, pretending to care, pretending to mean it. Take the song Look Who's Inside Again. Its lullaby-like melody carries a deep weariness as Burnham sings to re-entering the world, only to find he was never really in it to begin with. The screen has become both the threshold and the wall. It offers visibility without intimacy. You can be perceived, admired, cancelled, dissected, but never truly touched. And that, I think, is what Inside captures so well. The feeling of being so profoundly visible and profoundly alone at the same time. Burnham does not dramatize isolation in the conventional sense. He doesn't show us empty streets or abandoned cities. Instead, he shows us an over-connected man drowning in his own reflection. It's the kind of loneliness that belongs uniquely to the digital age. Not absence, but oversaturation. Not silence, but an endless noise of your own thoughts bouncing back at you through pixels. This is perhaps most painfully felt in All Eyes on Me, where Burnham invites us, commands us even, to look at him. The irony here is suffocating, yet he's centre stage, drenched in performance. He's completely in control of the audio-visual experience, and yet he admits to having panic attacks, to being unable to leave the house, to depression. The song walks a delicate line between confession and control. He asks for our attention, but he also pleads to be left alone. It's a haunting embodiment of what theorist Sherry Turkle describes in Alone Together, our contemporary condition of being connected but alone. We reach out through screens for comfort, but the screens never give back. It shows you yourself, and sometimes that's the most alienating image of all. What Burnham plays with here is the idea of affective dissonance. When the emotions we feel don't align with the emotions we perform, it's a tension felt all throughout social media culture, where smiling selfies might conceal breakdowns and oversharing becomes a substitute for connection. In White Woman's Instagram, Burnham's satire of curated identity, he slips suddenly into an emotionally genuine verse about a mother's death, and just as quickly snaps back into parody. It's a moment of emotional whiplash. The juxtaposition is jarring, and that's the point. The emotional bandwidth of digital life is a strange mixture of sincerity and simulation, where earnest expression is always accompanied by a hint of doubt. Is this real, or is this just part of the content? This is something that Lauren Ballant explores in Cruel Optimism, where she discusses how our attachments to fantasies of comfort and connection can become obstacles to our flourishing. The internet, and more broadly screen life, is one of those fantasies. It promises intimacy, authenticity, even fame. But what it often delivers is alienation dressed up as visibility. Burnham's work doesn't just show us this contradiction, it lives inside it. He is both the critic and the product of a culture obsessed with watching and being watched. And yet, there's something so deeply human about how Burnham processes these contradictions. He never claims to be above them. He jokes, he sings, he spirals, he sets up a shot for 20 minutes only to end up weeping in the middle of it. There's an honesty in that process, not because it's unmediated, but because of the mediation itself becoming part of the emotional expression. It's not despite the layers of performance that we understand Burnham, it's through them. The artifice becomes a kind of truth. Even the way Inside is structured mimics the emotional logic of the internet. Disjointed, looping, never quite resolved. Sketches cut off abruptly, songs bleed into monologues, we jump from satire to sincerity in a matter of seconds. There's no tidy narrative arc here. Because digital life doesn't follow arcs, it follows algorithms, trends, dopamine hits. Burnham translates this fragmented structure into his filmmaking, using jump cuts, sudden shifts in lighting and audio to reflect the emotional static of life online. The result is not just a film about being alienated, it is formally and effectively alienating, and that in itself becomes authentic. So what does all this tell us about mediated emotion, and what does it mean to feel things in a world where every feeling might be turned into content? Burnham doesn't offer a clear answer, but he does offer a space to sit within the discomfort. Inside doesn't resolve its contradictions, it holds them and it lets them echo, and that might be the most honest thing it can do.
My question is, how do you suppose we make this better? Or like, how do we not make our kids' lives hell anymore? Because
I don't know. I mean, you guys know. Like, it will be. I think eventually it will work out. I don't know if it will. Truly, I don't. I defer to you guys more. I mean, what I'm like, I defer to you know it better than I do. You're within it, so I don't know. Get power and speak it in the room, or I don't have the solution. If I had the solution, I would have solved it or tried to. I'm saying I'm just trying. I'm only trying to be like diagnostic, not the word that means solving the disease. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't know. I just feel like this is the conversation. These are the questions that I haven't heard people say, and I can't solve it monologuing. You know, it just hopefully a conversation. So what do you think? Truly.
The internet didn't just give us new ways to distribute stories. It fundamentally reshaped the language we use to tell them. For filmmakers coming up now, this isn't an optional shift to consider or work around. It's the very foundation of how we see, feel, and communicate through images. The digital native storyteller isn't working in a new format so much as thinking within it. Their aesthetics shaped not just by cinema, but are by platforms, interfaces, feeds, and the rhythms of online life. Bo Burnham's Inside stands as a curious crossroads between cinema, theatre, stand-up, and digital media. It's cinematic in its execution, of course. It's beautifully lit, tightly edited, and very much framed with purpose. But it also wears the aesthetics of the internet on its sleeve. What makes it particularly resonant, though, isn't just its visual polish or Burnham's technical mastery. It's how deeply embedded it is in the mindset of the digital native creator. Every frame of Inside reflects an awareness of the screen as both performance space and a mirror, a mediated environment where the self is constantly watched, staged, and reconstructed. This is a sensibility that traces back much further than YouTube or TikTok. In fact, Inside has a fascinating and perhaps underappreciated parallel in Jim McBride's 1967 film, David Hoffman's Diary. Like Inside, Holzman's Diary is a film about making a film. It follows a young man who turns the camera on himself, believing that if he records everything, every thought, every encounter, he can make sense of his life. Of course, the result is the opposite. The camera doesn't bring clarity, it fractures reality, distorts relationships, and ultimately alienates him from the very life he's trying to stand. Watching Holzman unravel on screen is eerily familiar when viewed through a contemporary lens. The film predates social media by decades, but it anticipates the anxiety of living in performance. Holzman's camera is his confidant, his audience, and his prison, a device that both records and reshapes his experience. In this sense, it's an early exploration of what we might now call screen life cinema, storytelling that unfolds within or through a screen-based interface, from Unfriended to Searching to Inside, and hopefully beyond. Burnham's performance in Inside is far more stylized, knowing that Jim McBride's faux documentary approach, but both works grapple with the same core tension. The act of self-documentation is inherently performative. There's a moment in Inside where Burnham sets up a shot, he checks the framing, adjusts the lighting, presses record, and then he sits down to deliver a monologue about authenticity. The irony here is deliberate. By showing us the construction of the image, he breaks any illusion of spontaneity, but instead of undercutting the emotion, it deepens it. He's not pretending to be authentic, he's showing us the impossibility of ever being fully so when a camera is present. And yet, he keeps filming. The recursive structure, performing the breakdown while acknowledging its performativity, it's emblematic of digital native storytelling. It doesn't seek to resolve contradictions, it inhabits them. The self is both subject and object, the camera both tool and trap. Like Holden before him, Burnham uses the lens to understand himself, but the more he films, the blurrier that self becomes. And this, crucially, is not a failure of the form, it's the point. What differentiates Inside from Holzman's Diary, though, is the medium itself. Holzman shoots on film, cutting and assembling his work with analog tools. Burnham, on the other hand, records digitally, edits in real time, loops audio, layers effects, mirrors the syntax of vlogs, Twitch streams, and Zoom calls. The interface is part of the narrative. The digital glitches, overexposed lighting, and hyperactive jump cuts aren't just stylistic flourishes, they're aesthetic expressions of a fragmented psyche, shaped by constant screen exposure. There's also a stark difference in their respective contexts. Holzman lives in a world where turning the camera on yourself is unusual, almost pathological. Burnham, in contrast, exists in a culture where self-documentation is so routine that not performing for an audience feels unnatural. Where Holzman's Diary explored what happens when an individual begins to live through a lens, Inside reflects a world in which the lens is always already there, an inescapable part of how we relate to ourselves and others. This leads to a deeper question. If everything is being performed, then what happens to sincerity? Burnham doesn't answer this directly, but Inside suggests that sincerity in a digital net framework might no longer mean unfiltered emotion. It might mean acknowledging the filter, showing the scenes of the edit, the camera's presence, the artificiality of the moment, and choosing to still be honest within that. The moment in Inside where Burnham breaks down crying, or appears to, has been wildly debated for this very reason. Is it real? Is it staged? Or does it even matter? In a media ecosystem where emotional content is monetized and repackaged for virality, even pain becomes performance. And yet, Burnham finds a way to make that ambiguity feel human, not hollow. For filmmakers now, the implications are vast. The aesthetics of cinema are no longer bound by the tradition, they're shaped by the textures of the platform we use every day. The shaky webcams, the screen recording, the vertical frame, these aren't just gimmicks. They're part of a visual language that reflect how we actually see ourselves. Works like Inside and David Horseman's Diary show us that the act of filming oneself is never neutral. It creates a version of the self reshaped by the very act of observation. In that sense, Inside doesn't just belong to the lineage of internet content. It belongs to a much older cinematic tradition, one that asks us what it means to look at ourselves through a lens. But where earlier films often pose this question from the outside, digital native creators are now living it real time. They are the subject, the filmmaker, the editor, and the distributor all at once. This is the new grammar of cinema, not because it's novel, but because it reflects the world as we experience it now. Burnham's Inside stands as both an artwork of its time and a commentary on the time itself. It speaks in the language of the internet, not just visually, but emotionally, mapping a cultural moment defined by isolation, hyperconnectivity, and the increasingly blurred lines between performance and authenticity. In examining Burnham's use of internet aesthetics, his manipulation of digital tools, and his reflective storytelling techniques, this dissertation has argued that Inside embodies a new mode of digital native filmmaking, one in which the screen is not merely a window to the world, but the very fabric through which the world is processed. By placing Inside in dialogue with earlier works like David Horseman's Diary, we see these tensions between subject and spectator. These are not entirely new, but are radically now reframed by digital media. The difference now is that these questions are no longer rarefied or theoretical. They are part of how we live. We curate, we edit, we watch ourselves watching ourselves. As filmmakers and media consumers, we no longer passively observe the screen, we exist through it. For contemporary creators, this poses both a challenge and an invitation. If the internet has fragmented traditional narratives, it has also opened up spaces for new voices, hybrid forms, or radically personal ways of storytelling. Burnham's Inside is a compelling case study not because it offers answers, but because it dramatizes these contradictions with humor, vulnerability, and technical precision. It proves that deeply personal work can still resonate broadly, and that digital platforms, far from diluting the craft of filmmaking, can serve as its next evolution. In reflecting on Inside, we are also reflecting on ourselves and how we perform, how we connect, and how we tell stories in an age where everything is content and everyone is watching. The question isn't whether the shift is good or bad. The question is, how do we, as filmmakers, respond to it? And what stories will we tell with the tools we've inherited?